Hello once again to the Nefesh podcast. This is episode 27. Glad you are here listening. You know, I love almost always going to say all things British, but that's not quite true. But I am what you would call an Anglophile. I love British history. I love, interesting things about the United Kingdom. I had the opportunity to go there years ago on a missions trip and just realized how much in love I am with the United Kingdom and all things Britain. Both sides of my family are said to go back to some type of British connection on my mom's side. Got several British sounding last names and possibly going back to somebody in like the court of one of the kings, and then on my dad's side possibly somebody coming over on one of the like the Mayflower early pilgrims. And so I've got some British roots in there. I don't know if that's why I love the United Kingdom, Great Britain, or I think I mentioned before that Queen Elizabeth II, who passed away just a few months ago, she always reminded me of my grandmother. Just looked like her, and even my mom kind of resembled her when she was younger, resembled Queen Elizabeth II. So I think there's something that kind of was passed on from especially my mom's side that just loves the British stuff, and as unique as they are and as interesting as they are. And so I've been, especially lately, I've been trying to stay up with some of the stuff going on, particularly as it relates to the royals, because of course the royalty is always something that fascinates us, especially if you're here in America. I mean, we don't really, if you were born and raised in America, the idea of royalty and kings and queens was something that we threw off almost 250 years ago. And the idea that it's just not, it's something that is really foreign to us. And so you've got all these fairy tales about prince and princesses and kings and queens. I can honestly say that I don't think I've ever wanted to be a princess or a queen. You can have that job. That just looks like a lot of work for not a lot of, what can you get out of it other than getting to go see some cool places. But man, is it so much work. And I don't know that I'd be able to put up with all the stuff that they have to put up with. But I've been, especially recently, I watched the Netflix documentary about Prince Harry and Meghan, his wife. And then I recently purchased and am reading his biography. When they decided to separate from the British royal family, for those of you who aren't following, just hang, or aren't following that whole saga, just kind of hang with me. I'll give you the lowdown. But 3 years ago, right before COVID started in January of 2020, Prince Harry, who is the son now of King Charles III, the monarch in Great Britain, and Prince Harry is the youngest of the two, and so is what they would call in Great Britain the spare, so to speak. So you've got the heir, which is William, the oldest, and then you've got Harry the spare. So if something happens to William, you still have a spare. You got then another kid that you can throw the monarchy to so that it continues in its succession. So he and his wife, previously Meghan Markle, who was an American TV actress. In fact, I watched her. When they were getting together, I was like, I recognize her from an older TV show called Fringe, one of my absolute still all-time favorite. And she was on that show for just a couple of episodes, and I thought, oh, she's really cool. So he marries this American TV actress who is biracial and divorced. I mean, all of those things combined is like weird for British royalty. And but they were having a really difficult time, being bombarded by paparazzi, according to them, and just really it was really having a detrimental effect on their lives. And so they stepped back. It was a huge announcement, and again, it was one that I remember hearing about and reading about But it was so much was going on at that time for me, and then within just a couple of months we were into COVID, and so all of that stuff faded to the background. But what comes out of that, and what comes out of it, the documentary, what comes out of that, infamous interview with Oprah a couple of years ago, is the idea that this couple, this royal couple, and in Great Britain, the temperament is very much very they have a sense of humor, but it's probably a sarcastic and rough sense of humor. But really, everything is stoic, and you don't show emotions. I mean, this is very stereotypical, right? That's a stereotype, but that's typical. That's kind of what you see. And so the idea that this prince is unloading all of his dirt, so to speak, and his family's dirt in this biography, and then in the documentary, and in the interview a couple years ago, that he's so frustrated, and he feels like the palace and his family really are not essentially are choosing the monarchy over him. They're not trying to protect him because he's just the spare. He's just the youngest kid. He really doesn't have a role, and there's some truth to that. Doesn't really have a role in other than just kind of other royal duties. But so he feels like he wasn't protected, and his wife wasn't protected, and so it became this big thing. And so now he comes out with his biography. I remember thinking at the time, way back in January of 2020, I remember thinking, they've only been married a couple years. She's only been in the royal spotlight, the world spotlight, for a couple years prior to that. Maybe she's just kind of, they're just complaining a little bit, and they need to tough it out. Like, what's the big deal, really? The big deal, if you've been following, and if you're old enough to remember, was in late August of 1997, his mom, Prince Harry's mom, Princess Diana, one of the most iconic princesses in history, goes right up there with Princess Grace Kelly, and it probably even outshines her. I mean, she is one of the most well-known royals ever. She was killed in a tragic, horrific, violent car crash with her then boyfriend, being chased by paparazzi in Paris in a tunnel. And they were going 65 miles an hour in this tunnel, and the driver lost control. It's kind of up for debate whether or not the paparazzi really got in the way. And, well, they were, in my opinion, certainly complicit in their hounding her. They were trying to get away. There were a lot of mistakes there. I think the driver was said to be under the influence of something. And but I mean, she was killed almost instantly. Within a couple hours, they took her to the hospital, and she died. Prince Harry was 12 at the time. His mother was one of the most well-known people in the world. Photographs of her were, I mean, you could get so much money if you got a photograph of her, a snapshot of her, especially one that nobody else had. She was one of the most photographed women in the world. Most well-known, and again, royalty. And at the age of 12, his mother is violently ripped from him in an already difficult situation. His parents were divorced, and their marriage had gone, global and worldwide, and there was so much just drama around it, and around him and his extramarital affairs, Prince Harry's dad and her, and it was just a mess. And then you're growing up in the spotlight, unlike anybody else. So I think, again, a comparison would be in the United States of America, our president, if they have kids. So remember back when we had a couple of young kids in the White House, President Barack Obama and his wife and their two daughters. Growing up in the spotlight is pretty hard to do, but that was just 8 years. And beyond that, because we as humans have such a short attention span, especially today, we go on to the next thing, the next president or the next president's kids. Trump's kids were all over the news. I think they were old enough to like it and wanted it at that point. I don't know about the youngest, but That's a rough thing, and it's real in that not only is it a danger potentially, everybody knows you could be kidnapped, and there's a lot of stuff that goes along with that, but it's so high profile. It's such an intense scrutiny. Well, imagine that you're in that type of under the microscope, under that scrutiny, all of your life. It never goes away. For the royal family, it never goes away. They're always under guard, always under, think Secret Service and think about it in kind of as it relates to what it would look like in Great Britain. I mean, that's their life. For a 12-year-old boy who doesn't even look like them, he's got red hair. I think that's interesting, and he mentions that several times in his book. Being this ginger, as he calls himself, and as others may refer themselves, or others with red hair, that is an unusual trait, and so he stands out from the others. He's the youngest. He's not the smartest, or claims not to be the smartest. And at 12, his mother is ripped from him. And then you fast forward to January 2020, and you hear about some of the stuff that was taking place, some of the threats. And if you know at 12 and you're processing through that most of your life, he suffered no doubt PTSD, not just from that, but he also went to war, served in Afghanistan. Within that situation, the paparazzi hounded your mom and made her last few years miserable. And you're starting to see something like that happen almost like on repeat to your wife, and to then your child, as she was pregnant and they had a son before they decided to step away. And the fear that must have gripped his life, the fear that must have come to that conclusion to say, being a royal in Great Britain is just not worth it. At least for him in his life, and his wife and his son and his soon-to-be daughter. Imagine what it would be like to say, especially if you feel like you're not getting the support of your family. Imagine what you would have to come to a point. It had to have been such an extreme decision that he felt like it was better to leave, and not knowing what would happen, because you were so afraid for your life and your family, that you would give that up. And they did. And so he wrote a biography. She's going to write her biography. They did a documentary series. They're going to do other films, that essentially that's to pay the bills, so to speak. I mean, they're getting a lot of money. $100 million for a Netflix documentary. That's a lot of money. That's a lot of money to pay a lot of bills. But in that lifestyle, and especially if you've got to pay for your own guard and security as really a top priority, that's a whole other layer, right? But they gave up all money other than his inheritance from his mom, Princess Diana, gave up all royal money. And they said they were willing to let that go for some sense of control and sense of security for their lives. And again, you can almost draw a straight line from that event in 1997 to that decision in January of 2020. And I haven't finished his biography yet, but what stands out to me so vividly in his book is his sense of not feeling seen or heard or understood. And obviously there's two sides to every story. There's fault that goes around. He made a lot of stupid mistakes. But it's the fact that he felt that way. And it's clear that he felt that way in these memories that are in his life, that he felt that way all his life. Even, I remember reading those stories about him after he was born. that he didn't even look like anybody really, and so maybe he was the son of this captain, I think James Major James Hewitt or something, who had dated Princess Diana briefly. I think had dated her and had red hair, and so they're like, oh, it's he's not even a royal in that sense. He's not even Prince Charles's son, now King Charles, and so he even hears that rumor, and whether he kind of dismisses it, but that's something that's part of his upbringing. And so what I hear and see throughout this biography so far is just this desperate need to be seen and heard and understood. Our stories are so important. I love reading biographies. There is nothing that hooks me more than hearing somebody's story, hearing it, reading it, watching it. I think that's one of the reasons I love history so much. Is I love just to hear people share their story. And it could be a small story, a glimpse into their life, or it could be their life story. And especially as I read people's life story, or as I hear their life story, I can see these themes that come together and that help me to understand who they are. In fact, if there's somebody that I really struggle to like, it's not a lot of people, but every once in a while, they just kind of, they're not my what would we say, cup of tea. They take a lot of grace required. We all do, but there are certain people in our lives, we all have them, that we may struggle to understand and may struggle to have grace for. When I hear their story, it changes everything. When I hear what they've experienced in their life, when I hear them share about difficult experiences or even good experiences, but when they are real and genuine and share their life experiences, it changes everything for me. I mean, I may still struggle to fully, give them grace and like them and want to spend 24 hours a day with them. But it absolutely pulls me in and allows me to have a whole lot more grace and understanding and patience than I would prior. Our stories matter. Our stories are important. Our stories were meant to be shared, and they were meant to be heard. We see this importance on our story in the book of Acts. With Saul, who becomes known as Paul, which is just the Greek version of Saul. His story, his conversion story to Christ, is shared 3 times. It's shared first as he's experiencing it in Acts chapter 9, as he goes through this major experience of falling to the ground, a light shining from heaven, being blind, hearing a voice, Jesus telling him, that he's persecuting him, and Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? And he's so just overcome by this, he's brought into the city blind, and he doesn't eat or drink, or at least eat. He doesn't eat, I think, at the very least, for 3 days, and he's praying and he's waiting for somebody to come and really tell him what to do. I mean, prior to this, Saul is on his way to Damascus to go and round up Christians and kill them. Saul was a devout Jew, a devout religious Pharisee who thought Christians were blaspheming God. And it wasn't until this moment, this experience with Jesus, that his life was completely changed, and he becomes the Gentile, the missionary to the Gentiles, to take the gospel, the good news, to non-Jews. Well, that whole story in Acts 9 is super important. But if you're reading the Gospel of Acts, and even hearing it back in those days as it would have been done, not the Gospel of Acts, but the Book of Acts, the letters and the books back then would have been read together when you came together, and you would be hearing it, and they would read the whole thing, or maybe divide it up if it was bigger, but you got the whole thing. And in Acts, Paul's conversion story is mentioned 3 times. And not just mentioned, it's described 3 times. So picture this. You've already got the full story in Acts 9 of what happens. Luke, who is believed to be the writer of Acts, he lays it out in very careful detail. But then, as Paul retells the story in Acts 22, Luke could have just said, and Paul shared the story of how he had been converted on his way to Damascus. Because he's already shared it in Acts 9. So it would be like me sharing again that whole story and that whole storyline of Prince Harry 2 more times in this podcast. Don't worry, I won't. But it would be like me doing that. And maybe just emphasizing a few different things as I told it again. And then as I told it again. Luke could have just said, hey, Paul told his story in front of these people. He didn't. He wrote what Paul shared. He shared the story again. And then he does it again in Acts chapter 26. Paul is speaking before these powerful leaders, and he recounts again. And I'm sure Paul has already done this probably hundreds of times. But Luke chooses these 2 times to describe Paul sharing the story. And he doesn't say, and Luke shared his story. He actually writes and records what Paul said about his story. Now, there's slight differences, not changes, but almost emphasis. And so Luke could be emphasizing different things in each version. But again, it's the same story. Do you ever have family members who tell the same story when they get together? The same story. Like, I've heard that story 1,000 times. Pastors are really notorious for this. I have to preface, whenever I'm teaching or preaching, I always have to preface this by saying, I think I've shared this before. I'm not sure. I'm going to share it again. If you liked it the first time, get ready, because here it comes again. It's the same story. And I know that every time I tell a story, it's going to be different. And I know that every time I tell my story, it's going to be different. Partly because I may be at a different place, and so maybe seeing something differently, especially if it's about my story or stories or things that have happened to me. I might emphasize something different, might see something, I might add something to it that I hadn't before or hadn't thought of before. But it's the same story. Well, there is something significant that scholars believe about the number 3. Jesus was in the grave for 3 days before he rose again. He rose again on the 3rd day. Jonah was in the belly of a fish or a whale for 3 days. In fact, Jesus even references Jonah when he talks about this kind of rising again, 3 days. The Godhead, 3 in 1, God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Spirit. Peter denies Christ 3 times. When asked if he knows who Jesus is, on the night that Jesus was arrested and beaten, people are asking Peter in the hearing of Jesus. Jesus is right there. Hey, don't you know this guy? And Peter's saying, no way. He doesn't want to be arrested too. And he denies him 3 times. And then in a scene of reconciliation and restoration, Jesus, in the book of John, John chapter 21, as Jesus is gathering with his disciples, and one of the last few times, there is Peter. And he focuses on Peter. And he says, Peter, do you love me? And Peter says, yeah, Jesus, I do like you. I do really, 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 really like you. And Jesus says, okay, but feed my sheep. And then he comes again and says, Peter, do you really love me? And Peter says, Jesus, I have great affection for you and great affinity for you, and I consider you like a brother. Jesus says, okay, but I really need you to take care of my sheep. And then finally, Jesus asks him one more time, Peter, do you love me? And that love word there in the Greek is agape. And it is the unconditional love that Jesus displayed to all humanity when he gave up his life for humanity. Peter, do you unconditionally love me? There are several words, and you probably already know this, is several words for love in Greek, and Peter is not using really the agape love. We have one word, love. And so it's hard for us to understand that. But there's brotherly love, there's erotic love. I don't think Peter used that term. But he's using other forms of love. So it's just stronger than like. But it's not the agape. Do you unconditionally love me, Peter? And it's like he's breaking Peter down. Peter, do you unconditionally love me? Jesus, I do love you. He asks him 3 times. And again, there seems to be a significance to that asking 3 times, to the acknowledging of the betrayal 3 times. And the number 3 seems to reflect, in biblical understanding, a type of death and new life. Paul's conversion is repeated 3 times in the book of Acts, as it reflects Paul's death to his old life and his old way of thinking about God, and new life, understanding Jesus as the Messiah, as God. Our stories are meant to be told. They are meant to be shared. It is good for our soul to share our stories and to be heard. And one of the things that I used to love the most was when my older brothers and sisters, some of them are as much as 17, 18 years older than I am. I used to love when they would come around when I was a kid. They were my favorites. Especially as a young kid, my not quite heroes, I don't think, not in a negative way, but they were just my favorite people, all of them. I mean, some of them more than others, but all of them, when they would come around, the 5 of them, the 5 of them older ones, older than the younger ones. You know, they had other lives. One got married, and you know, one had a couple kids, and but they were out of the house. It was 5 of us at home, and the other 5 gone. And when they would come around, I just loved being with them, and I loved hearing their stories. And I loved hearing their stories that they would tell about themselves. And I loved hearing their stories that they would tell about me and others. And I loved the connection that was there. I felt so close to them just hearing their stories and connecting with them. It is good for our souls to share our story and for our stories to be heard. There is something healing. There is something forming. There is something that changes. There is a growth process that we experience. And this is one of the reasons why in this podcast I am so intent to bring on as many people as I can to hear their stories. Some funny, some tragic, some painful, some just moving. Everyone enlightening. Every single one. Do I learn something and feel connected to them? And do I then see myself in a different way in comparison? We are each other's mirrors. You help me to see what I can't see about myself. And hopefully I do the same for you. And when we share our stories, something takes place inside of us, and something takes place inside of others who hear and receive it. Now, our stories need to be held and cared for. So when you're listening to people's stories, you know, make it look like you're interested. Keep eye contact. Don't look at your phone. Even if it's your youngest kid who's repeating the same thing over and over again, pay attention to them, hear them, let their story be held by you as the sacredness that it is their life. And there are some stories we can't share fully to everybody. Reading Prince Harry's biography, I think, that might be, you might want to rethink that one Prince has. I think that one may not go over well. But I understand the desire to get it all out. I understand that what he's doing with his book is he wants to be heard. He wants to be seen. He wants to be understood. You say, this guy's seen everywhere. I see him on every magazine. He's on all the news. He's talking about his book. Won't he ever stop talking about it? I saw so many, reviews that were a little harsh, kind of like, he's sharing everything. He really doesn't need to anymore. I get it, though. He's never felt seen. He may be physically seen, but is he really seen for who he is? I want to encourage you to begin writing down your story, or talking about your story, or starting a podcast and sharing your story. Begin writing it down. Begin making notes for your kids. Begin sharing, begin writing a journal so that they have something of you when you are gone. Make a video, whatever it is. Share your story. It is cathartic, it is healing, and it is absolutely vital to our spiritual formation process. Take time every day to share a little bit about it, whether it's to journal it, to do a video blog, to whatever it is. Share your story. Share it appropriately, but share your story. And allow us to see not the fluff, not the stuff you want us to see, but the stuff that's really you deep down. I would love to hear your story. And you can share that with me directly. The nefeshpodcast@gmail.com. I would love to hear your story and read about you and your life. Well, thank you for listening once again. This has been episode 27 of the Nefesh podcast. I am thankful for you and how this may be ministering to your soul. And would love to hear how it is ministering to your soul. And we will talk to you next time.